Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever it is that you're joining us from. My name is Joshua Carton. I'm an associate professor and the associate dean for graduate studies and research here at Queen's Law. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of Queen's and the law school and Dean Mark Walters, who I see in the audience here. Although we might be joining this meeting from different locations, virtually, we are all here at Queen's in Kingston. And it's important that we acknowledge that we're within the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, the indigenous peoples for whom these territories are central to their culture and identity. And we're lucky to be able to live and work here. There's another somewhat sadder acknowledgement that I have to make, which is to mark the sudden and untimely passing of our dear friend and colleague, Professor Art Cofield, a couple of weeks ago now. Art was a Queen's Law graduate and a true pillar of our academic community, beloved as a teacher and as a colleague. Art was also a scholar of international tax, perhaps the leading thinker about taxation of cross-border electronic commerce. I know he had a great interest in the themes of this book and had planned to attend this event. Simply put, we miss him. But on to happier duties, we are here to celebrate the launch of Nicolas Lamp's stunning new book with Anthea Roberts, Six Faces of Globalization. As you can see, I have my copy right here, and I'd encourage all of you to buy it and read it. But of course, this isn't just a plug. We aren't on a late night talk show. Our goal today is to subject the book to the kind of rigorous and interdisciplinary analysis that it deserves. The remarkable feature of this book is the way it steadfastly refuses to pass judgment on the different narratives that shape our continuing debates and confusions over the meaning and effect of globalization in our lives. Nicolas and his esteemed co-author are both international lawyers, but the book goes well beyond legalism. For exactly that reason, we have assembled a panel of 3 Queen's University luminaries who will discuss this book, which is all about understanding different perspectives, from their respective disciplinary perspectives. First, we will hear from Robert Wolfe, Professor Emeritus of the Queen's School of Policy Studies and founding director of the annual Queen's Institute on Trade Policy. I'll be giving very brief introductions of each of our speakers so that we can get right to the discussion that you all came here to enjoy. Our second speaker will be Beverly Lapham, professor in the Queen's Economics Department, an expert on international trade and finance, and a member of Statistics Canada's International Trade Advisory Committee. And finally, representing the legal discipline, Assistant Professor Alyssa King, a scholar of international and comparative procedural law, whose research focuses on the intersection of different normative systems in dispute resolution within and across borders. I should note that you are welcome to pose questions to the speakers, but given the limited time, I ask that you do so by sending me a question through the chat function or by posting it for everyone to see. I will collect the various questions and pose them to the speakers for comment and discussion at the end. And now I hope you will welcome my friend and colleague, Professor Nicolas Lamp, who will provide an overview of his book and its themes, how he and Anthea came to write it, and why they adopted the method of using contrasting narratives about globalization as their analytical starting point. Nicolas.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's such a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to also say that I miss Art very much. The last email that I exchanged with him on the Saturday before he passed away was about the book. I've told some of you already that he was reprimanding me about the fact that I hadn't submitted my grades in time, but then used the book as a way to uplift me by saying how much he was looking forward to reading it. And so I really want to dedicate this event today to Art. And I also really want to thank Alyssa, Bob, and Bev for joining me. One of the greatest privileges of writing a book is that you have the chance to see your colleagues engage with your work. And I'm so much looking forward to this event today. I will share my screen to say a little bit about each of the narratives and tell you a little bit about why we wrote this book. So the origins of this book go back to 2016. And those of you who follow international trade and debates about globalization may remember what happened in that year. It was the year of the Brexit vote. It was also the year of Trump's election to the US presidency. And both of those events really shook the foundation of international economic law and international economics, because really what we had thought would happen was that essentially international economic integration would proceed further and further. We would, yes, there would be hiccups, and we would sometimes not succeed right away with trade negotiations, but broadly we would go into one directions. And the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump were probably setbacks that we had never experienced before in the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War. But there was another thing that struck us about the debate that emerged after the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump. And that was that those who we see as the people in the establishment, in the economic establishment who were defending globalization, reacted with a lot of, with dismissiveness and even contempt for these challenger narratives that were emerging. And we felt that there were sometimes, these reactions were sometimes missing the point. If you look at the reports that the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund put out after the vote, they were emphasizing how trade was benefiting everyone, and were trying to essentially drown these new insurgent narratives in data. And what Anthony and I both thought was that they were missing something else about these narratives, which is that were not only about different empirical facts, they were also about different values. They were also telling different stories about globalization. And in order to really understand these competing narratives, we had to take them seriously as narratives that that identify certain villains and heroes, that tell certain causal stories, yes, but that also have a certain moral of the story that highlights certain values. So I just want to briefly introduce the 6 narratives in this, and essentially provide a map to these narratives. The first one is the one that I already mentioned, this very positive establishment narrative, which is that ultimately globalization is a force for good, right? Because we all were going to become richer. And yes, there are some losers in the short term, but they will just have to adjust. They have to find new jobs, move to new cities, and ultimately we're all going to become richer. From the left, that had long been challenged, and probably the financial crisis was the galvanizing moment for what we call the left-wing populist narrative, which was pointing out that even though, yeah, there was more wealth around, ever more of that wealth was being appropriated by the top 1%. What Trump and the Brexit voters really brought to the fore is what we call the right-wing populist narrative, which was also not denying that there was a lot of wealth, but it was essentially saying that what we're losing through globalization is more important than what we're gaining, because we are not only losing jobs, we're also losing communities that are being destroyed by the offshoring of manufacturing jobs. We are seeing the rise of deaths of despair, where ever more people are dying by suicide, alcohol, or through overdoses. And so we're destroying really our country by engaging in unfettered globalization. At around the same time, there was yet another narrative emerging, which was saying that, well, it's not really the case that through trade, we all going to become ever more peaceful. Right? And that was one of the assumptions of the establishment narrative is if we just trade, if we become economically interdependent, we will all stop fighting wars because we just can't afford to do it. This narrative, which we call the geoeconomic narrative, was saying that, well, actually, if you're trading and becoming economically interdependent with a strategic competitor, and particularly China in this case, you're opening yourself up to vulnerability. So it's not the case that trade will lead to peace. In fact, peace is a precondition for trade, for engaging in trade responsibly. And so we have to try to reduce international economic interdependence because we cannot trust China anymore. And we're just giving ever more leverage to China. Another perspective, which we call the corporate power narrative, says that, well, if we're thinking about international trade in terms of competition between countries, we're getting it all wrong. Because the real winners of globalization are the corporations. They are able to play workers in different countries off each other by moving to the places where they get the cheapest wages. They're also able to play governments off each other by moving to the places where they can pay the least in tax. And so if we're not attentive to the transnational dimensions of the winners and losers in globalization, we are missing an important part of the story. The final narrative that we consider, which we call the global threats narrative, is a narrative which says that all these other debates about who wins and loses are really besides the point. It's like fighting over the deck chairs on the Titanic, because while we're having these distributive struggles, the entire ship is going under. If we are continuing on our current path of ever further economic growth, we are inevitably generating ever more emissions, and we're all going to end up losing. Yes, some are going to lose the most because they're going to be most affected by climate change, but ultimately we all are going to lose. Right? And so the picture that emerges from these 6 narratives is that at the top, we have the establishment narrative, which is a win-win story about globalization. In the middle, we have these 4 narratives that identify different winners and losers, depending on whether they focus on classes or and they focus on different distributive flows. And finally, at the bottom, we have a lose-lose narrative about global threats. And as we were writing the book, there was a second global threat that we couldn't ignore, which was, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Nicolas, for that helpful background. We're going to turn now to our panel, and I'll just remind everybody who's watching that you're welcome to send questions through the chat function, which I will pose to the panelists. But we'll hear first from Bob Wolfe. You're still muted, Bob.
Okay. There it is. That's the leitmotif of the pandemic. We have to tell each other to unmute ourselves. So what can I say about this book except bravo? It displays incredible erudition. Roberts and Lamp have mastered a huge literature and massive detail, from learned scholars through journalist anecdotes, even to quoting from a West Wing episode. The narratives bring order to our contemporary cacophony. They help us to make sense of the political discourse about globalization. And that matters because we all live in information silos. It can be hard to understand what others think if we never hear them. The narratives they describe interpret the same facts in different ways, or they stress different facts. How people frame an argument about some current policy problem is often rooted in how they understand the forces of globalization. I was asked to be on this panel because most of my research is about trade policy. Trade experts will benefit from the way the book characterizes and organizes the narratives about globalization that we hear every day. I think the book is best at describing those 6 narratives, but is it useful as an analytical tool? Last week, US Trade Representative Catherine Tai told a virtual World Economic Forum panel, Davos on screen, that the pandemic has presented an opportunity for the world to rethink globalization and forge a better trading system. That sounds like an articulation of the corporate power narrative. But then she added that countries should avoid devolving into fighting and protectionism, which is a strategic nod to the establishment narrative, the one that's no doubt held by her Davos audience. She admitted to being sensitive to charges of nationalism, which suggests she doesn't want to be tarred with the right-wing populist brush. And she concluded that we need to think about the green transition and rising inequality, which sounds like another strategic nod, this time to the global threats narrative. The book is full of metaphors, from Rubik's Cube to foxes. The one that works best for me and the one that helps us make sense of Catherine Tai's remarks is the kaleidoscope. When I was teaching policy analysis, I used to begin with a picture of a dock and then ask whether it needs fixing. The cottage dock can be a place to tie up a sailboat or for a teenager to get a tan. It can need fixing because safety rules have changed or because the ice shattered it again. And the problem with that same dock, or the narratives we tell about it, can differ for the teenagers and the grandparents or the family and their neighbors. All the problems in collective life are kaleidoscopic. Policy analysts need to see all the elements and how they shift in relation to each other depending on your perspective. One of the book's great strengths is showing us how globalization as a policy problem is like that too. Anybody who thinks that there's one right answer about the problems with the family dock or the challenges of globalization, and that they are standing in the right place to see that problem is delusional. But we weren't asked either to praise or to critique the book today, but to consider its merits and limitations for scholars in our own fields. So the first question posed to us was, how does your discipline approach the opportunities and problems associated with globalization? I wear 4 hats in answering that. As an academic, I am first a political scientist, second, a part of the subdiscipline of international relations, and third, a former teacher of policy analysis. and my research focus is trade policy. The book is overwhelming in its size and scope. It takes effort to begin to see the absences, to think about what more it could do. Missing from the book, and it took me a while to see this, is an explicit definition of globalization, and hence the political salience of the concepts is slippery. Perhaps each narrative means something different. By globalization, the left-wing populism chapter brings in globalization only tangentially. How do proponents blame globalization for the ills they observe? The chapter on right-wing populists, in contrast, begins by showing how globalization is at the core of their angst. As a political scientist, I would have liked to see more use of opinion polls in the book. Yes, the narratives are features of Western political discourse, but how widely held are they? And do they differ by country? In a public opinion poll that I helped design some years ago, we asked what people thought of trade agreements and globalization. Canadians turned out to be more comfortable with trade than with globalization, though in 2017, support for both was higher than it had been in 2001. More interesting was trying to get at the values and interests that motivated those responses. If I designed the poll again, I'd use the narratives to motivate some of the questions. The second thing that panelists were asked was, how does the approach taken by the book chime with or contrast with the perspective typically seen in my discipline? As an international relations scholar, one of the odd omissions in the book is a discussion of power, except obliquely in the corporate power chapter. Even the geoeconomic chapter and the Against Western Hegemony section don't engage explicitly with what, for my field, is a central concept. And yet the debates between different understandings of globalization hinge on what power is, who has it, and what you can do with it. For example, in maintaining or challenging an international order. My discipline really arose out of the ashes of the First World War. Scholars asked, how do we avoid doing this again? This intellectual motivation was amplified by the Second World War. International relations as a discipline asks questions about how states can cooperate with each other and the role of international organizations. The table that begins part 3 in the book is great in showing the main factors that distinguish the narratives, including the view each takes of the relative gains problem. In international relations, whether states pursue absolute or relative gains is one way to think about whether international cooperation is possible. States most worried about relative gains are least likely to cooperate, and international organizations have little influence. My disciplinary commitments are closest to the establishment narrative. As set out in the book, it's useful as caricature and straw man, but it has limitations. In my view, the drafters of the GATT and then of the WTO did not believe in unrestricted free trade. The regime allows considerable scope for domestic intervention. Tolerance of things like anti-dumping is a feature, not a bug of the system. But the core in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is Articles 1 and 3, the non-discrimination principles of most favored nation and national treatment. For me, those are first the basis of stable international relations. It's a kind of golden rule. Stability comes from treating other countries and their firms from other countries as you would wish to be treated. Doesn't always happen, of course, but it's an important principle. The difficulty that we establishment types have with some of the other narratives as policy advice is that they would undermine the principle. And then in the conclusion, Robertson Lamp raised the possibility that another issue, such as geopolitical competition or climate change, might displace economic globalization as the zeitgeist of our time. In that case, they say that the narratives they discuss will likely reorient themselves toward a new frame of reference. They're probably right, because underlying each narrative is an implicit ideological orientation or approach to the world. As a political scientist, I'd be interested in knowing more about those orientations. Questions I might ask include, how did the narrative see the role of the state or relations between the state and society? The last question posed to the panelists is, how can we talk across the conceptual divides encapsulated by the narratives identified in the book? I don't know. It's important to be able to understand the stories different people tell themselves, but that doesn't make the stories right. Policymakers need to be able to hear where others are coming from. But they also need some means to predict what will happen if they choose one action over another. They need an anchor while remembering that all points of view are partial. As for the challenge of disciplinary silos, I try to live one approach as an academic. My doctorate was in political studies, but in the past year or so, I've published in an economics journal, a law journal, and a policy journal. Now with an economist as co-author, I'm trying to get a paper published in an international relations journal. We have to help reviewers with different intellectual commitments to see that there's merit in our approach. Using the metaphor that Nicolas and Anthea end the book with, the reviewers want us to be their kind of hedgehog. Our problem is that junior journal reviewers should be more like foxes. Thank you very much for the chance to talk about this amazing book.
Thank you so much, Bev. So we'll hear next from the economics perspective, ably represented today by Professor Bev Lapham.
Thank you. So I'll just start out by saying I really got a lot out of this book. It's really well written and enlightening, and I don't want to gush too much, but I don't often choose to read nonfiction works besides economic research papers. I suppose some of you might say they're fiction, but anyway, once in a while I read a piece of nonfiction that really grabs me, and this is such a book. I think it'll make me a better teacher and a better economist. Okay, so let's talk a bit about economics and globalization. So generally, economics concerns itself with scarce resources and the constraints that societies face arising from that scarcity, and the incentives and mechanisms that determine how those scarce resources are distributed or allocated in a society. So scarce resources, constraints, incentives, mechanisms, those are key words in economics. Economists perceive globalization as an exceptionally complex, multifaceted phenomenon that has wide-ranging implications. Broadly, it's about how countries interact and integrate with one another. And this includes, but of course, isn't limited to the exchange of goods and services, international production structures, international borrowing and lending, immigration, I could go on. So what do economists see as some of the effects of globalization? I'd say most fundamentally, globalization eases constraints. All of the things that a country needs or wants for consumption or production or whatever does not have to come from domestic sources in an open globalized economy. This is the gains from exchange, and it doesn't necessarily involve labor moving across sectors or job losses. Secondly, globalization changes the incentives faced by economic agents such as consumers, workers, landowners, firm owners, et cetera. And this change in incentives causes shifts in the pattern of production in a country through some mechanisms. And those mechanisms might be fraught with frictions, physical, nominal, policy, and regulatory induced frictions, but frictions nonetheless. But the fundamental hope is that these shifts in incentives lead to an allocation of resources, which raises productivity. That is, to a new allocation, which deals with the scarce resource problem better than when there's no interaction among countries and real incomes rise. This is the gains from reallocation, and certainly does involve labor and other inputs moving across sectors, across regions, and may indeed involve job losses. Of course, the frictions that I mentioned before in those mechanisms and how those allocations occur are very important. Third, globalization can change the competitiveness of industries. Industries might become more or less competitive. It depends on the environment. And then finally, to the subject of the book, perhaps most importantly, globalization changes the distribution of income and wealth across different groups, both within and across countries. Groups such as different kinds of workers according to their educational attainment, their skill set, the industry they work in, where they work, labor versus capital, or firm owners, developed versus less developed countries. Anyway, redistribution. Economists certainly don't ignore these redistributive effects of globalization. We study them in our models and in our data analysis. But of course, we don't begin to have a perfect understanding of all the incentives and mechanisms which globalization alters that are the forces behind these redistributions. So how does the economist's approach differ from the narrative approach taken in this book? Well, to better understand the redistributive effects of globalization, the authors argue that narratives set the scene for analyzing issues, identify specific protagonists such as winners and losers, provide an account of a sequence of events and causal mechanisms, and provide a normative assessment of what happened and perhaps what should be done. I would argue that this is basically what economists do when they use theoretical and empirical models to analyze issues, questions, observations, etc. We set the scene by describing an economic environment in the model. That is, we specify the economic agents, the constraints, the objectives of those agents. And I want to note that the agents and their objectives can be very multifaceted and complicated. And so the agents can play dual roles in our story. For 2 and 3, in the narrative approach that I mentioned before, the economists would analyze the world within the model to provide an account of the sequence of events and the causal mechanisms that lead to outcomes through the lens of the model. And in doing so, identify which economic players are winners and losers according to the model's approach or assumptions or narrative. Part of that analysis might involve taking the model to the data for a reality check, because after all, the model must necessarily be an abstraction for reality. And then 4th, finally, economists often provide a normative assessment through policy experiments or counterfactual exercises, but of course, within the confines of the model. So we use our abstract and complex theoretical and empirical models to study the role of incentives and mechanisms in determining outcomes, including who wins and loses from changes in the economic environment. Through this approach, I believe economists often uncover subtle, hidden, and sometimes counterintuitive mechanisms at work. If we think about David Card's Nobel Prize winning work on immigration and minimum wages, I think that's a good example of this. Of course, each model only captures part of the complexities of an issue, and typically economists have different models about the same thing. The authors would, of course, agree with this characterization, I think. They relate a quote from Danny Roderick, which says, "Models are never true, but there is truth in models." They go on to say, "Narratives and models are useful because they permit us to gain traction on complex issues, but none will ever give us the full picture." Most economists, certainly I would strongly agree with this statement. Where the economist methodology and the book's methodology diverge, and the book is clear about this divergence, is that economists typically want to rank the stories told by the theoretical and empirical economic models according to their internal consistency and or how their predictions line up with what is observed. As economists, we usually want to pass judgment on the stories and find the right story, the one that is most consistent with what we observe. We particularly seem to want to do this if we're going to draw policy prescriptions and normative implications from our models. Of course, this is tricky business, this ranking. So if we take the 6 narratives in the book, an economist might want to ask 3 questions. And indeed, economists have asked these questions about winners and losers from globalization. Number 1, which ones line up with economic theory? Number 2, which ones are supported by what we observe in the data? And number 3, what is the relative quantitative importance of each narrative? Let's quickly take a look at the first question. How do the narratives line up with economic theory? Well, I would say that the establishment and left-wing populist narratives, and to some degree the right-wing populist narrative, is very much in line with what we would call a specific factors model of trade, where the immobility of factors is a key part of the description of the economic environment, and winners and losers are clearly identified. The corporate power narrative maybe is in line with the standard Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson model and other models which incorporate firms with market power, the division between labor and capital. The geoeconomic narrative is broadly consistent with literature on bilateral protection. Countries will want to use policy to shift market conditions in their favor. And global threats is partly about externalities and coordination failures across economic agents and countries. On the second and third questions, empirical questions, what does the data tell us about narratives? Well, there's the different narratives. There's a large literature trying to tease out of the data the relative role of globalization versus technological change and the fall of union power and et cetera on rising inequality in a country like the US. Of course, establishing cause and effect in such an increasingly complex world is a difficult task. But overall, the empirical literature indicates that globalization is certainly an important force behind rising inequality, but not the only one. For example, Darren Acemoglu has recently argued that the most important factor is automation of production processes. He further argues that such automation-fueled inequality is the result of choices corporations and the US society has made about how to use that technology. That is, it's a result of the incentives and mechanisms US society has put in place. So I think that the economist's approach of building models and seeking to find the best model is complementary to the book's approach and not a substitute for it. Both have value. So finally, how do we open up the lines of communication across the disciplines about the impacts of globalization? Well, as Bob alluded, the authors of the book encourage us to discuss and think about the impacts of globalization using a fox-like approach, allowing for scattered and diffused thinking. Well, depending on our discipline, most of us have been strongly discouraged to engage in scattered thinking. Indeed, when I was first reading this book and getting deeper into the narratives, I became rather unsettled because I thought, oh, these all have merit, a lot of merit. Yeah, I think this is going on and that's going on. And I started feeling kind of undisciplined, unconvicted, and I had scattered and diffused thinking. Turns out I got to the end of the book and I was told that was okay. So how do we avoid just speaking past one another? First, we should try and find a common language to discuss the issues, and agreed upon set of terms that mean the same thing to everyone vested in the discussions. Second, can we try to truly listen to each other, not with the goal of swaying, but with the goal of understanding another perspective, at least initially. And third, can we make an effort to actively seek out discussions with individuals who have very different backgrounds and worldviews than we do? Again, not with the role of convincing them necessarily, but with the goal of learning about their views and where those views came from and the implications of the views. Sadly, I'm not optimistic, somewhat like Bob regarding the latter. I'll circle back to scarce resources, constraints, and incentives. In our busy lives, do we have the time and energy to do our due diligence and seek these people out? And I'm sure that we're not explicitly incentivized to do this. So just to finish, as the authors state, none of the 6 narratives contain the whole truth, but there's truth in it each. This rings true far beyond these 6 narratives. Most people hold their beliefs based on personal experiences, the experiences of people around them, and the information they've accumulated. Nobody's experiences contain the whole truth, but there's truth in each. Shouldn't we be curious to find and digest those other truths? The book's a great step, I think, in that direction. It does a lot of the work for us regarding the winners and losers from globalization. And we should be very grateful to the authors for writing such a book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bev. Our third panelist is Professor Alyssa King from the law school.
Thanks, Josh. And thank you to Nicolas and Anthea for writing this book. I followed both of your work for a while, and I can see kind of the different threads being pulled together here. It's really interesting. And so I want to talk about two main things, and then maybe some takeaways for talking across disciplines. So the first is why I think this book came out of 2 law schools, and it makes so much sense to me. It came out of 2 English-speaking law schools, and sort of what it is in law that kind of might let us do that, might let us be playful in this way. It's really cool. And I wanted to talk about what lawyers and law professors might get from this book. So why is this coming out of law schools? Well, in law, we get to be a little bit more undisciplined, I think, than some other disciplines. We get to draw on whatever we want from the other social sciences to understand the law. And part of that is our orientation as a professional school, right? As a discipline that is explicitly about affecting the world. And sometimes talking very directly, right? There's a lot of pressure to make policy prescriptions, which they avoid in this book, but also lets us sort of pull in information that we want from other disciplines, sometimes in ways that other disciplines might object to. But we, the business of lawmaking and law applying draws on information about how the world works. And so when you're trying to understand that, you go out and try to figure out how the world works. You see combinations of JD PhDs, you see people citing works in economics, works in political science, a little bit less, but some of that going on. History, definitely in the course of doing their work. And it can lead to a sort of hubris, right? So we get grand theory in a way that probably strikes everybody else as a little amateurish, because, sometimes it is. And that can lead to arguments that law's not a discipline. I think that's wrong. I think we are disciplined. We have our own sphere of technical sophistication and expertise, and that is grasp of legal doctrine. And specifically how different sets of rules interact with each other. This is something that we can tell you that pretty much nobody else can. And even people who work with sort of law and stuff are usually people who have behind it like a really firm grasp of what the law is and how it came to be that way. And but both of these authors are excellent lawyers, but why would being an excellent lawyer then lead to you thinking about wicked problems like globalization like this, where we don't see a lot of discussion in this book about how specifically a treaty text was changed, and then where exactly one statute shifted. I think, well, when we think about systems, right, usually without the benefit of being able to prove causality, even where you might have natural experiments, sometimes, right, changing one thing is going to change your input. So it's actually very hard to talk about causality when you're talking about law reform. And so we often can't do that. And we also think about texts and narrative, right? We spend a lot of time analyzing texts, and in order to understand both, what's within it, but also how it came to be. And that often means understanding the stories that people are telling about the law, about why it came to be that way. Understand the stories that judges are telling, right? They're sort of retelling the story of why this is this way. And they're also possibly telling a story about themselves in doing that. Whenever we tell stories about law, we're telling stories about who we are, who we aspire to be. And so this type of interpretation of narratives is something that lawyers and law professors know very well. In common law, we talk about interpreting judges' decisions for fit and best light, right? So we interpret them to see how they fit with a broader ongoing narrative of what this legal rule is, how it's been interpreted, right? How can we take these seemingly disparate decisions out of, say, different superior courts or different courts of appeal, and then turn that into like an understanding of what this concept is. So take a controversial example, so general principle of good faith underlying our understanding of contract law, right? You can look at a bunch of different decisions that seem slightly different and see if we can fit them all together. And then we also talk about best light interpretation. So best light interpretation, right? Again, taking this sort of disparate stories about the way things are and fitting and putting them in their best light, at least according to the author. So that's slightly different from what Nicolas and Anthea are doing here, right? Because that's according to the author's idea of what would put it in its best light. But it is this sort of trying to read something sympathetically, the way that they approach these narratives sympathetically. So one thing that this book is doing is it's taking a law professor's way of arguing and thinking about the world and applying it in a broader context. To show how these tools apply to globalization. And so where do these 6 phases of globalization matter to law? Well, the book is focused a lot on the West, and on a West that's the US and to some extent the EU and other settler societies of the British Empire. And then you have China and Russia as the main foil. And I would argue that, when you're talking about how narratives play out in these places, especially something like the US and China, you're looking at politics, right? It makes sense to me that this is not a law-heavy book in that way. But you can see how politics then shapes novel legal approaches or shapes doubling down on an existing legal approach, how this might cash out in treaty language. There's some discussion of that in the book, right? When they talk about, say, renegotiating NAFTA, I can see Nicolas's work coming through there. And I can see Anthea's work coming through and how we might talk about, say, non-state actors and how they're mobilizing the narratives to ask for what they want. And you can see them, I think that people will take these narratives, particularly where they're talking about the jurisdictions that are sort of the main protagonists in here, and play them out in specific legal debates, things like not just trade, but ISDS. So that's interstate dispute settlement, rules over IP, a lot of different legal fights where when you're talking about the big countries, this is going to be analytically useful. And is very useful also to the extent that it helps us understand coalitions across jurisdictions. Right? They suggest that states may not be the right analytical unit. And that's something that's also apparent, especially in some of Anthea Roberts's other work. And it's hugely important point to get across when you're talking about comparative and international law, because we start with states in international law in a lot of cases. But if you're trying to understand how, this treaty language got in there, it might make more sense to look at coalitions across borders where we have the coalition agreeing on certain narratives, right? Or a coalition between a couple different narratives that then people go back and push in their own countries or in their own institutions. And one thing I'm wondering there is to what extent there are institutions or texts that contain multiple values, right? Where their creation actually doesn't reflect agreement, it reflects a sort of marriage of convenience between these different coalitions. And so then there might be a third, right? A third coalition that does the interpretation. So one possibility is that we have changes at one level, say changes to treaties to reflect a coalition between some narratives outside of the establishment narrative, but then the interpreters are attached to the establishment narrative. So to what extent does that come back in? And I also wanted to propose a sort of friendly amendment of sorts, and that's that there may be something lost in focusing on the big country narratives, because the big countries may not be the most important users of law. Law can be a tool for the weak, the tool for those who don't have this kind of political power on the international stage. So I'm thinking of smaller states that want to intervene in international law. The Gambia, in its case against Myanmar, would be an example, but also jurisdictions that are trying to become legal hubs. Some of Matthew Erie's or Pamela Bookman's work on places like Singapore. And there, right, you don't have the big countries in charge. And in fact, you see a lot of overhang from previous eras. Neither the US nor China are providing the personnel or the legal models for these places. It's actually, according to research that Pam and I have done, overwhelmingly the UK and England and Wales in particular, right? The English legal model. So one thing to think about when we're talking about law is not just present narratives, but how there are overhangs from narratives of previous eras that are still shaping what we do. But with that, I will not try to pull all these threads together, but just say there's a lot to think about it. I think it will affect how lawyers argue and how we think about these narratives, and be interested to see what you do next with it.
Thank you, Alyssa, and to all three of our panelists. We have some really trenchant and I think difficult to answer questions from our audience. Fortunately, we've got about 40 minutes to try to hash through them. So I'm gonna dive right in, and I'll ask our panelists not just to answer the question, but also please do try to bounce off what each other are saying. So the first question takes a step backward to ask, well, where did these narratives come from in the first place? And how did they come to have a hold on the minds of big parts of the population? Are they used cynically to gin up support, or how much are they sincere? What role does the media have in promulgating? I was going to say, maybe I'll ask Nicolas just to quickly react to that, and then we'll get comments from the others.
Great. So one of the methodological choices that we make, apart from not passing judgments on the narratives, is to take them at face value, because we simply feel that if we go behind, first, we didn't have the methodological means to actually figure out whether people hold the narrative sincerely, but we also felt that we don't necessarily need to know, in the instance of a particular proponent of a narrative, whether they actually hold the belief sincerely in order to be interested in understanding why these narratives resonate. And so this is simply, that's one reason why we don't have the methodological means necessarily to understand whether they are sincerely held. But secondly, we also felt by looking at the debate that if you don't take people at face value, those kinds of conversations that we were hoping to facilitate are invariably going to fail. And to just give you one example from politics, when Obama said that the voters in the Midwest who are frustrated about jobs, that they cling to guns and religion and blaming foreigners, whereas really it was all about economic problems, you could see how he eliminated almost any foundation for a true conversation with these voters in that very moment, because he wasn't taking what they were saying at face value. And so we felt that yes, of course, it's important to figure out whether, for example, a particular campaign is financed by money from the fossil fuel industry, or whether what the economic interest behind some of these narratives are. But that we felt that wasn't something that either we could do, or either, but also something that wouldn't really help what we were trying to do, which was to have this good faith debate about the views. Because even if some of them are opportunistically motivated, clearly, given the resonance that they have, there's a good chunk of the population that takes them, that really believes what these narratives say.
Josh, if I could jump in on that.
Please go ahead.
One of the points I made was about ideology, and the book doesn't talk about ideology, and yet you, I think, could easily see that there are pretty strong ideological predispositions behind each of the 6 narratives. And so in some sense, that's where they came from. And that's why they'll persist. And that's why if the big question of the day turns out to be something new, we might see very similar kinds of narratives emerging, because people who believe that corporations rule the world will tend to believe that about whatever the policy problem is. And those of us who think Kant was onto something in the 18th century might also still hold to something that looks like the establishment view, or more specifically a liberal view of how the world works.
Beverly, Alyssa, does one of you want to add to that?
Sure. I'll just say, I think that the book speaks to this a bit in the switching narratives chapter, right? That sometimes the people who have these different views might borrow from the other ones if it strengthens their argument. So that's a bit more on the cynical side, that I'm willing to borrow from another narrative if it helps mine. So, but I think there's a difference between whether the question of it is, are they sincere and are they true? Are they correct, right? So I think that they are sincere, right? The people, based on their, again, life experiences, the people who are making these arguments the strongest, this is the way they see the world, whether it's how the world really works. Again, that's a bit what I was talking about. Economists would like to know. That's a very difficult question to answer, but those are different things. And then with regard to the role of media has a huge role, I think, here in terms of this siloed approach and this idea that it's very difficult to communicate with one another, because media has made it easy to simply reaffirm your views and not, it should have been easier to talk to other people and get diverging views, but as we have seen, it's easier to get confirmation bias of your view. So the role of media moving forward and allowing us to have these important conversations and hearing what other people are saying and giving them careful consideration, I hope it changes. But yeah, media is a huge part of the discussion, I think, moving forward.
So if I can cut in here, we're getting a bunch of different questions, I think, on this related set of themes, which is you have these different narratives. As the book argues, and as I think that the panel accepts, each of them has some truth, even if there are factual claims that some of them rely on that can be disproven. So can they be reconciled, or given that they see the world differently, ideologically, and in some cases factually, are they necessarily competitive with each other? inconsistent with each other? Or can they be competitive without being inconsistent, or inconsistent without being competitive?
Well, we argue that there are definitely overlaps between narratives. And in fact, I just presented the narratives kind of sitting next to each other, but a big part of the second part of the book is to show where coalitions in, for example, treaty negotiations are due to overlaps between narratives. These overlaps are often what Cass Sunstein has called incompletely theorized agreements. So you may agree on a particular policy for different reasons. Just to give one example, in the NAFTA renegotiations, Lighthizer was happy to abolish investor state dispute settlement because he wanted to create uncertainty for US firms investing in Mexico, whereas on the left, there was a support for abolishing investor state dispute settlement because people were concerned about the Canadian or the US governments being sued and therefore experiencing regulatory chill. So that's just one example. So clearly there are overlaps, and I think analyzing these overlaps is one of the reasons why it's useful to have a clear sense of what the narratives are. But the second point that I would make is that I think the task for politicians, especially in this polarized age, is to try to design policies that speak to the concerns of all narratives. And to just give one example, like when you attack an issue like climate change, as Macron tried to do when he implemented the diesel tax, and you just pay attention to the establishment narratives, which would say, well, great, a market-based solution is a fantastic idea, it's efficient, and the global threats narrative and say, yeah, we have to do something about climate change. But you ignore how that same policy, namely imposing this diesel tax, will be perceived from the perspective of other narratives, such as the left-wing populist or right-wing populist one. Your policy is going to be likely going to go up in flames, as you saw with the Yellow Vest movements, right? Because that same policy, which makes so much sense from the establishment narratives and the global threats narratives view, is seen as just another imposition on the downtrodden by the elite from the left-wing perspective or from the right-wing populist perspective, who see, oh, the city-dwelling elites, they continue to fly, but they're imposing a tax on our diesel. So in order to kind of future-proof policies, I think it's essential that you try to, or I think if there's a takeaway, that politicians try to bring in concerns from these, from all different narratives to the extent possible. Of course, it's not going to be, there are trade-offs, and we have a chapter on the trade-offs that show that you can't actually reconcile them all. But if you look at Biden's approach when he came into office, or even Olaf Scholz in Germany, you see a conscious attempt to speak to different, to bring in values that are brought to prominence by the different narratives.
Here's where I both disagree with the book and agree strongly with it, perhaps even more than what Nicolas is saying there. The Rubik's Cube metaphor that he uses, and with those 6 faces all on one side of the cube, really encourages you to think that somehow they are mutually inconsistent, that they are quite different perspectives on the issue. But as Nicolas knows, I don't like the Rubik's Cube because you can make it look a gazillion different ways, but in the end, there's only one solution. And smart kids can get to it now in about 5 seconds. But the kaleidoscope metaphor, that's terrific, because that takes all the different elements that are in play in these 6 phases of globalization. And depending on how you play with that kaleidoscope, they start looking different. It's that point where you begin to see, as Nicolas was just trying to say, that they're not necessarily inconsistent with each other. There are ways in which they can be brought into relation with each other, and ways in which, in fact, they undermine each other. And the thinking in kaleidoscopic terms is a way to tell the policy analyst, well, keep playing with this until you see how it comes together.
Thanks, Bob. Alyssa?
And I would also just want to stress here the indeterminacy of all of this, right? Because this is not a situation where, okay, maybe we can get a coalition between 3 of these different narratives, and that's enough, and we're going to, reconcile it and decide on this policy. No, this is going to be an ongoing conversation, and it will not be a situation where, just because you get a coalition together momentarily, you've resolved the thing. That there's going to be questions of implementation, and who's implementing it, how, do they in fact buy into any of the narratives in the coalition that created the policy to begin with, or the law to begin with, and iterate again and again and again.
Bev, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I just say that, the thinking, as Nicolas talked about, the overlap and the trade-offs across them, right? That's exactly the way an economist would think about these different competing but complementary potentials, narratives or stories as to what's going on. And again, what we would want to do as economists typically is, go get the data and try and measure, quantify how big is the impact of trade on the type of inequality that the left-wing populists are talking about versus the type of inequality that the right-wing populists are talking about, for example. So having truth in each one, absolutely, but trying to find out which is the most quantitatively important for outcomes that we care about, particularly as policymakers. It seems to me that's what we want to drive towards. Getting there is of course difficult because of the complexity of the issues and just the world. A lot's going on. So how do we tease out these things? But yes, absolutely pay attention to all the narratives, but trying to think and quantify the differences between them, I think, is something that an economist would strive to do, as I said.
Maybe I could just pose one more question on this line, and then I want to move on to a couple of other themes that have come up from the audience, which is, it ties directly into what Bev was just saying, which is that a lot of these claims are measurable, are quantifiable. So it's one thing to be receptive to different perspectives and to acknowledge, which I think is true, that all of the narratives depend on facts that are true facts. You just put a different importance on them, right? But at the same time, a lot of the debates are driven by claims that are not factual. Whatever label you want to give them, truthiness, fake news, and so on. They're things that make us feel like we're right without actually being empirically correct. So how do we have a conversation that bridges narratives, but at the same time does not indulge those who deliberately or unknowingly spread disinformation or misinformation? And I should add that friends of mine who come from the global south, including the person who posed this specific question, tell me all the time that we here in Canada, at least, underrate the impact of misinformation in other parts of the world.
Yeah, that's a really tricky question. And while we were writing the book, you made this conscious decision to kind of leave conspiracy theories out of the debate and not engage with those, because I think they raise a whole different set of issues. But of course, the line is sometimes becomes difficult to draw. And I must also say in our defense that conspiracy theories weren't quite as widespread at the time, or at least didn't appear quite as widespread as they appear now in the wake of the pandemic. But I would agree that clearly the narratives are different in the degree of receptiveness to empirical facts. And so you could see that, for example, the establishment narrative has been moved more closely to some of the concerns of the right-wing populist narrative in response to economists coming up with verification of some of the concerns. So, for example, David Author's and his co-authors' work on the China shock had a huge impact on the establishment narrative that arguably no piece of evidence could have had on the right-wing populist one, because it's simply less open to facts, right? Trump was asked, well, why do you hold these views about terrorists? Like, where do they come from? And he simply said, well, that's what I've believed this for 30 years. Like, it's just, I can't really tell you where they come from. So there's clearly much more potential in working with narratives that are willing to consider empirical evidence than those narratives that are really not open to any empirical arguments. And so we don't want to make it seem that they're all the same in that respect. In some narratives we see evolving much more quickly and being much more responsive to empirical evidence than others.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
It seems to me there's a double issue there. One is how can we be persuasive between narratives? And I think that's what Nicolas was talking about. And it can be really hard to persuade people of facts that they don't want to be persuaded about. So that in a sense, that's the public discourse in which we all participate in some way. You have to feel a great deal of sympathy for Theresa Tam every day because this public discourse is swirling about her and with respect to vaccines and masks and all the rest, and it's horrible. On the other hand, there is what the policymaker does. And there you have a different view of Theresa Tam's job. She has to ignore the disinformation and the conspiracy theories and just try to follow what the models and the facts tell her in making recommendations about good policy. And I think that's true in any domain in which we want to work. And I think this is Bev's point, that at some point, we bring our models together with evidence and see what it tells us. In that sense, policymakers have to have an anchor. They cannot simply think that, well, whatever the outcome of the political discourse is, it's going to be fine. They have to have some way of deciding that they understand the facts, they understand what to do. And then they're back to the first part. How do you persuade people to act in the way you think is right because they don't want to be persuaded? And those are two different things.
Alyssa or Bev, do you want to add something to that? No
Just
obligation.
that there may be a role for, I mean, it's related to what Bob was just saying, a role for showing that certain views don't have any empirical support, which is different than showing that certain views do have empirical support, right? So trying to squash the misinformation through evidence, but it's only going to be received by the people who are open to those types of arguments. But, you know, I'm just saying those are different types of empirical exercises. So it's something to consider for policymakers.
Thanks, Bev. I'd like to shift gears. We got a question that I thought was interesting because it pulls directly on exactly what we've been discussing, but an aspect of it that I think is often left out, certainly by lawyers and economists for the most part, but to public policy experts as well, which is that we often in our disciplines think of globalization as primarily an economic phenomenon, so small e economic, dealing with flows of goods, of capital, of services, and so on across borders. But one of the biggest things that's changed in our world with the acceleration of globalization has been the movement of peoples. And so what do the different narratives on globalization have to say about immigration and refugee policy?
Well, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but for the establishment narrative, it's essentially the same logic that applies to the free movement of goods and services, also applies to free movement of people, right? We have huge benefits to reap from allowing the free movement of people, and that's the easiest way to make people richer is to move them to a different country. The corporate power narrative would also, I think, emphasize the asymmetry between the free movement of capital that we allow and the restrictions on free movement of people, right? Which really is part of the reason why corporations can play off workers against each other, because the workers are mostly fixed in place and can't just move, whereas the capital can go wherever it wants. The most difficult part of writing the book and engaging with the narrative came for me, at least, when I was trying to be empathetic with the right-wing populist narrative and of course the anti-immigration stance of that narrative, and that was really hard. I was trying to put myself into the shoes of the proponents of these narratives, and it required using quite different sources than you would normally use, because in like the establishment media, there would always often be a reluctance to sympathetically portray or give voice to proponents of those narratives. So I spent a lot of time on YouTube listening to interviews with voters and trying to understand what was happening. And so the challenge here was to try to write it in a way that would still be seen as true by a proponent of the narrative and as adequately expressing the concern, while at the same time making the narrative understandable and legible to those who are not proponents of the narrative. And I don't want to get too much into depth on what those concerns are, but that was probably the most challenging part of the book to write, was the right-wing populist narrative on immigration.
Anyone else want to react to that? Bob?
The book almost always pairs globalization with economic. So when I was thinking about my comments, I kind of left out cultural factors because in a sense, the book explicitly says that's not really what we're talking about, although immigration does come in. In the survey that we did on Canadian attitudes to trade and globalization, we had what we thought of as values questions. And some of those were really cultural questions. Some of those were about immigration and migration. And when you start looking about why there's more support for trade than there is for globalization, often enough, the issues that are driving that gap are the cultural ones. So that in a sense, if you simply call globalization trade, people are kind of comfortable with it. If you say that globalization is, let's put it frankly, movements of people, not so comfortable. And the other thing, the bigger thing to say is that really what globalization is about is the movement of ideas. Yes, so ideas are embodied in the iPhone that we buy from California and China kind of simultaneously, but ideas also just flow around the world instantly. That's why we have disinformation spreading so quickly. And that could be as much as any, and in fact, when you think about what's going on in China, they're trying to slow down the globalization of ideas because they don't like how that works. So I think you would come up with at least qualifications for every single narrative if you had these additional dimensions of globalization. But that would have been a book that was at least twice as thick and we'd be here for another couple of hours. So just as well you didn't go there.
Thanks, Bob. Alyssa?
Yeah, so I'll just say briefly to Bob's last point, I studied the globalization of ideas, right? This globalization of different legal mechanisms, sometimes through text, sometimes through people, and specifically globalization of procedure and approaches to courts. And so he's right, it does not entirely track the money, but in commercial law, it comes close. Right, there's often a correspondence between where you see effects of economic globalization and where you see pressure as a result of that globalization to harmonize approaches to commercial law and to civil procedure. And then on the immigration question, I'll just say that, so I'm not our immigration person, and we have two people who know a lot more than me on faculty, and supposed to suspect some other people as well. But one thing I can say is it seems to me that to be an area of law where the establishment narrative does not hold, right? So in a lot of areas of domestic law that touch international affairs, the establishment narrative is often quite well entrenched, at least where we're talking about, again, the US, EU, British settler colonies, right, where the places that Nicolas was focusing on in the book. But when you get to immigration, that's not true. And you don't see decisions or procedures that are consistent with an establishment view at all. You see kind of a mishmash of other things coming in.
Thanks, Alyssa. Beth?
Yeah, so when I gave my presentation, I said, this is what economists mean by globalization. And I listed a long set of things, including immigration. I think though that there's a division between the movement of people and the movement of everything else, the exchange of goods and ideas and capital and intermediate inputs, financial assets. They're all very different than people because of the psychic costs associated with the movement of people. It's just a whole different thing. We have communities, we have families, we have things that affect the way we value where we are and what we do. That's very different than, you know, a piece of equipment. It doesn't have those things. And the psychic costs and the ties there are very important. And there's also just a sensitivity to it throughout history, but very present now in terms of the politics of immigration. That's quite different than other forms of globalization, and especially, I mean, Nicolas was referring to the right-wing populist view, the other. That becomes really present, I think, in discussions of immigration. So it's you know, it's a very, to me as an economist, it's a very different kind of movement as part of globalization than those other things, which I would lump not together, but in one big group, and this is off by itself. So.
Thanks, Bev. In our final 10 minutes or so, I want to turn to a question that I think is very much in the spirit of the panel today, of interdisciplinary perspectives on an interdisciplinary perspective, which is this. It seems that in different disciplines, particular narratives tend to be dominant. So is it true, for example, that the establishment narrative, as described in the book, remains the establishment narrative when one speaks of the economics establishment or the public policy establishment or the legal establishment? So in your discipline, for each of you, do you think that a particular narrative is dominant? Is it dominant among the academy specifically, but not among the profession, or vice versa? Or not among politicians from the public policy point of view? And why do you think particular narratives have purchase within different academic disciplines? Excuse me. There's a lot in there, I know. Among other things, I'm asking you to psychoanalyze yourselves and your colleagues.
Well, maybe if I can start. I mean, I used to teach the course, my international trade law course, by starting out with essentially the economic case for free trade, and maybe there were some limitations that sometimes popped up, but it was really focused on that class. I had the class where I usually distribute candy and let the students trade, and they all discovered that they're better off after they've been able to trade the candy that they had. And 2 years ago, I just started feeling that didn't cut it anymore, right? I couldn't just portray the field in this way, that's the economic case and everything else is a limitation. So I started organizing the course by the narratives and started kind of slotting different legal topics into under the heading of the narratives. And I think that is something that my colleagues also feel the need to do. When I look at policy, particularly in the United States, some of the people we showed the manuscripts to, they misunderstood establishment. They thought establishment was kind of referring to geoeconomics, because in Washington at this stage, the geoeconomic narrative has displaced the old free trade view, and has, in at least in many circles, become the new establishment narrative. So I think in the academy, there's clearly, in the last couple of years, among international trade lawyers, a much greater openness, a realization that the establishment narrative is no longer that dominant, and we really have to take into account these different perspectives. And in policy circles, at least from what I've can observe in the United States, we have this shift where arguably now the geoeconomic narrative has become dominant.
What about the rest of you? I should say that the questioner posed the question specifically about economics faculties, but I thought it was more broadly applicable. But maybe I'll ask you to go next then, Bev.
Okay, well, I think certainly the dominant narrative has shifted, as Nicolas just said, in his profession, same in economics. I mean, when I teach international economics, depending on the level, I either start or fairly early, I teach the basic gains from trade theorem, which is the establishment narrative. But in that statement of the theorem, there's a line that says, in the presence of transfers across different groups, then everyone can be made better off by trade. So there's a recognition there that there will be winners and losers, and so you need these transfers, but nonetheless, everyone can be lifted in the presence of those. Well, then we quickly move to, in my courses, emphasizing distributional effects of trade. So most of what I talk about through the rest of the course is how different models, what different models and empirical studies have to say about the effects of trade on different types of groups. But then I always, I will often come back and say, but remember, we have the gains from trade theorem that says, this, but we really do need to be cognizant that there are these winners and losers, and economics takes account of that. However, I don't find that necessarily when I talk to other economists that they're necessarily emphasizing that and this doesn't just break down by, at what point in their career they are. The establishment narrative is still very much present in economics, but an understanding that distributional effects matter, it really varies, I think, across the different economists, right? We're heterogeneous people as well. But as an example, not long ago, a very prominent young rising economist presented a paper about some empirical methods to look at something. I can't remember what it was, but afterward I spoke to him. I said, this would be really awesome to take to thinking about the effect of increasing trade on inequality. And he was like, oh, that's not important. It's all about technology, automation. So I think it's hard for me to say what is the dominant narrative in economics these days. I think that's going to vary across economists for sure, but there is a rising importance of thinking about distributional effects, both theoretically and empirically.
Thanks, Bev. Alyssa, what would you say about the legal profession, the legal establishment, if we can use that word?
Yeah, I think we can, at least in specific silos, right? Because there's lawyers who think about globalization a lot, and then lawyers who don't have to think about it every day, or don't think they do. And so I would say among lawyers who think about globalization, right, there might be more heterogeneity in government lawyers. Certainly, we were just talking about immigration. Nobody who does immigration is thinking that the establishment narrative has it all right. But when you get to arbitration, it's people I talk to a lot, particularly people in practice, the establishment narrative is definitely still dominant, and is often sort of the way that they think about their jobs and justify the existence of their jobs. I'd say when you get to investment arbitration as opposed to commercial arbitration, there are different camps, right? It becomes almost frustrating because there's a state side and an investor side camp, and the investor side camp is very heavily invested in the establishment narrative, and the state side camp is often very heavily invested in a bunch of other narratives that their clients are pushing, and those same people get chosen again and again by investor on one side, by state on the other, to constitute these panels. And so it can become really ossified and frustrating because for people in investment arbitration, right, their sort of jobs are linked to adopting a specific narrative. In commercial arbitration, it's not like their jobs are linked to it, it's just sort of the air they breathe.
I think that tracks with my experience as well. There's a saying, I can't remember who it was. I think might have been Sinclair Lewis, that it's difficult to get someone to understand something when their livelihood depends on them not understanding it. With that, especially because I know he has class in 9 minutes, I'm going to turn the microphone back to Nicolas for a little wrap up and final word.
But I think Bob hasn't had a chance to answer the question. I don't know, Bob, did you have?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's absolutely right. Did you want to say something about public policy schools and other public policy circles?
I had hoped you forgotten about me, so I didn't have to answer the question.
No one is being obliged here.
Okay, well, I just want to take Ken's question from the chat, whether the lesson is that we should all listen better and maybe not necessarily try to convince everyone else of a single perspective. I think it's much would already be gained if we are more open about the trade-offs, because I think one of the mistake that the establishment narrative made, and that has come to lead to distrust of the establishment, is that they portrayed it as the solution is evidently better for everyone, and maybe in some metric, in some value system it is. But if you're not open about the trade-offs, and you're not especially also the trade-offs, not just in terms of monetary terms, but also the trade-offs between different values that you accept in pursuing a particular course of action, then you're going to alienate others, and you're going to foreclose the kinds of debates that you really need to have. And so I think yes, obviously listening better is an important part of that, but also just acknowledging the amount of uncertainty and the value choices that enter into our policy choices more openly would go a long way towards building a broader base and facilitating a broader conversation about the policies that we are pursuing. So that with that, I just want to thank thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, Bob, Bev, and Alyssa, and also on behalf of Anthea. I know she's going to watch this and be extremely pleased by this level of discussion and engagement. So thank you so much for taking time to look at the book, and it's been such a pleasure to hear your thoughts.
I'll reserve for myself the last word. Thank you to Nicolas and Anthea for writing the book. Thank you to Alyssa, Bev, and Bob for discussing it. And thanks to the rest of you for joining us today, for posing such perceptive questions. And in the spirit of the book, I hope we can all continue the conversation and take each other at face value. Thanks, everybody.